The 11th Marine Corps Reserve District in Los Angeles presents a special 1951 Memorial Day edition of the Marines Report. On this Memorial Day, 1951, it is fitting to note that since the beginning of civilization, poets, statesmen, and plain citizens have tried to find words and ways to honor the best of their youth who have fallen in battle. It was the Roman poet Horace who wrote the words, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." Those words have appeared over statues and monuments throughout the world, but they are not true. It is not sweet to die for one's country. It is tragic. Time and again we have lost far too many of our bravest and best. With them have gone the hopes, the dreams, the plans and ambitions that might one day have given us leaders in science, industry, or statesmanship. Any one of those who fell might have uttered the words of General William Tecumseh Sherman. He said, "I am sick and tired of war. Its glory is all moonshine. It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood, more vengeance, more desolation. War is hell." Those were General Sherman's words, and he knew from experience, as do all military men, that it is not sweet to die for one's country. It may be fitting, it may be necessary, but it is never sweet. If there is a proper epitaph for our honored dead, then perhaps this might be a fitting inscription for their monuments. Tell all Americans, you who pass by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. Yes, our fallen heroes lie obedient to the first law of our great democracy, liberty. And speaking of proper epitaphs for our honored dead, the Call of Taps is another, perhaps the most beautiful of them all. The story of the origin of that haunting and nostalgic refrain known as taps is a very interesting one. And Major John L. Clark, the Public Information Officer of the 11th Marine Corps Reserve District in Los Angeles, has joined me here today to tell you about it. Major Clark.
Thank you, Sergeant King. My story begins during the dark days of the Guadalcanal fighting in the South Pacific during World War II. A small group of battle-hardened Marines were clustered around an open ditch, a ditch that was to become the final resting place for many of their fallen comrades. A chaplain had muttered a few words, something about these men who have valiantly given their lives for the cause of freedom. The men standing along the edge of the crude grave stared straight ahead, their faces barely masking the emotions that coursed through their minds. The occasional hasty blinking of an eye to dispel a tear was the only visible signs given by these men who had gathered to pay final tribute to their dead Marine buddies. A lone Marine made his way towards the center of the open area. There he hesitated a moment, then raised a battered bugle to his lips. He closed his eyes and started the first strain of the mournful, yet at the same time peaceful, Call of Taps. The music seemed to float along the side of that wooded ridge, resounded echoingly through the now quiet valley, then seemed to make its way heavenward. As the final haunting note of taps faded away into the fast-gathering darkness, the group of Marines slowly began to drift away also, a few quietly talking among themselves, others stealing away to be alone during this period of sadness. A short time later, an old Marine sergeant was checking over his battered company. One of his men was not in his regular sleeping place. The sergeant recalled the fellow's name, remembering that he was younger than most of the other men. He stood silently for a moment, thinking back. Then he turned and made his way back up the ridge to the cemetery. As the old sergeant approached the graves, he made out the figure of a lone Marine sitting cross-legged on the ground. He heard the occasional sound of a sob, and as he watched, he saw that the young Marine was scratching out a name upon a crudely made wooden cross. "I'm sorry, Sarge," said the youngster as he looked up and saw that someone was watching him. He said it slowly, as if apologizing for his tears. Then he continued, "But there was someone kind of special here today." His voice trailed off, and he said no more. The lines in the old sergeant's face softened as he spoke. "Yes, I know, son. One of those men was your brother." The young Marine had finished the name he was carving. He seemed to feel better now, and his words rushed together as he spoke. "You know, Sarge, I was all right until I heard that bugle. And then, well, it just sort of got me." He stopped for a moment as if searching for the right words. Then he continued. "After hearing the bugle, I wanted to do a little more than just put a cross up. I kind of wanted to say something like they put on real gravestones, like a verse, something kind of beautiful. I bet the guy that wrote Taps felt sort of like I do tonight. Maybe that's why he wrote it. You think so, Sarge?" The old sergeant sat down next to the boy and propped himself up against a coconut log. He lit a cigarette and handed one over to the kid. "Yes, son," he said, "a lot of us feel things like this at times. Some of us can make up pretty words to say like a speech. Others maybe put their feelings into music. Kind of like old General Dan Butterfield, the night they blew taps for the first time. Yes, the general felt about like you do, son. Way back in Virginia in another war, July 1862, if I remember correctly, and it happened something like this. After 7 days of bitter fighting before Richmond, the North's Army of the Potomac lay encamped at Harrison's Landing on the James River. Vacant places in the ranks were a sharp reminder of the heavy losses that had been suffered, and to officers and men alike, there now came a sobering realization of what a terrible toll the war between the states was sure to take before it was all over. Up and down the long, winding valley rose the bugle calls, echoing to the distant hills. The rhythm of camp life was punctuated by these soaring notes. If it had not been for tents and uniforms, the setting would have suited a summer poem. With time heavy on their hands, the thoughts of the soldiers turned to home and loved ones in the North. The close of each day found many men in a mood not untouched with sadness. Some of this feeling must have crept into the consciousness of old General Butterfield. A brave commander, he was also an expert musician with ears keenly attuned to harmony. While homesickness hung over the army and the nights were filled with tender retrospection, he took a sudden dislike to the discordant lights-out call, which had been handed down from the early days at West Point. He began to turn over in his mind a combination of notes that would express the peacefulness of a great camp after nightfall. Soldiers sleeping, sentries keeping watch under the stars, rest after labor. The scene must have inspired the musical phrase, taps. When General Butterfield was satisfied with his musical combination, he sent for his brigade bugler. Whistling the notes over and over, he taught them to the young musician. Whenever the bugler made a mistake, the general would correct him, and the result was that in a very short time the bugler was able to sound taps perfectly. In order to preserve the call, the general copied down the notes on the back of an old envelope. That same night, General Butterfield's brigade was the first to hear the lingering refrain. Its music carried up and down the valley, and the wistful, haunting notes struck a responsive chord with thousands of other listeners. The next morning, the general was besieged by the buglers of other camps. Taps had caught their fancy, and they were curious about it. They wanted to know its origin, its meaning, and even asked for a copy of the score. All were given permission to use it. Whenever the new lights out was sounded among Union forces after that, it excited immediate interest. The music of it lingered in the memory of every soldier, and they all came to love it. It passed from corps to corps until at last, by general orders, it was substituted for the old lights out call and was officially printed in the Army regulations. Since that time, as everybody knows, taps has become an American tradition. It is used for the military burial service by the veterans of all wars. That use has undoubtedly given it the most piercing association. It moves listeners as no other bugle call can, and at the first notes, a hush will fall over the nauseous crowd. As the old sergeant finished his story, he pulled the young Marine to his feet. "You better get some sleep now, son." "Okay," said the youngster, "just one more minute." Then the sergeant watched as the kid made his way to the freshly mounded dirt and quickly pushed his homemade cross into the soft soil. It was then the sergeant noticed another inscription that had been carved on the cross while he had been talking. Along the rough upright section of the cross, another word had been carved. The black wood with its deep white notches spelled out the word TAPS.
The story of this famous call of TAPS was told to you by Major John L. Clark of the 11th Marine Corps Reserve District in Los Angeles. And with its telling on this Memorial Day, we are reminded that if democracy is to grow and prosper, each citizen must contribute his share. And when that democracy is threatened by the vicious chain of circumstance, either American men must fight, risk death, and die, or democracy itself will die. The men we honor on this day, men whose names are permanently enrolled in our hearts, have acted as true Americans and contributed more than their share. The honor we pay them now can only be a part of our debt to them, can only be paid by being certain that America is strong, productive, and prepared. From their hands as they fell, we received the torch of liberty. It is our solemn duty to hold it high, for if we break faith, their sacrifices will have been in vain. This ends your special Memorial Day edition of the Marines Report. We hope that you have enjoyed our program, and until we meet again, this is your Marine reporter, Technical Sergeant Bill King, saying, Semper Fidelis.